kind of invested in like closing that gap in student data.
Right.
And I feel like that's like
But how does it connect up
it's
the
like,
academic
first of all,
impact model?
they have to, exactly.
Yeah.
Like the second observation debrief, when you can show them how their first set of next steps improved. Like when you have that discussion about like you did this, and you happened as a result, then they're more invested too, and this works, like as a problem.
Like pointing out really making the successes that are there, because it's so easy. It's human nature. You focus on what you're weak or struggling in, and so having real honest conversations about that, but making sure that you point out the victories and successes along the way, so that they can replicate that and know, okay, when you did this and it led to this, how can you replicate that in other situations? But I also was saying on a larger scale, part of what core members need to feel invested is a safe environment where perfection is not the goal. The goal is to be able to take the risk and try something new. So that whole welcoming environment piece is huge, because you can be invested and be terrified to fail, and therefore you may not take that next step.
This might be getting like too concrete and all this, but like one of the things too that I
like concrete.
I'm not sure if this is the right direction, but one of the things I always found was really helpful too is talking with my core members about like what potential actions, like presenting a whole bunch of potential actions and saying like, okay, which ones do you think will be most effective, which ones sound most effective for you, and like sort of going through that together as a process, like never having just like one thing.
I think that's like a good segue into like this next part of thinking about the fact that school directors, and you're not necessarily going to be the ones who are actually doing the observation debrief cycle. So as school directors, how would you then check the reality of your core members being able to walk away from ODCs, feeling invested in the next steps, making sure they're following along?
One of the ideas that I had, that I don't know how this would look in real time, but if part of the debriefing between CMA and CM was for part of that conversation to be, let's look at what you did a really great job of following through on, and what are some things that you feel got pushed to the back burner or maybe weren't as successful, or you had anxiety about attempting these things. Let's really talk about that, and having some really candid conversations about, okay, in response to our conversation last week, this is where we ended up, and this is what we followed through on, and talk to them about what made you feel compelled that you could, this was a possibility and you could do this, and what gave you anxiety about this step, or challenges were about this step, and then bringing that back to like weekly meetings and sessions, so that you get kind of a very informal look, applause points of your CMA saying, look, this is what my core members are telling me in terms of when they feel like, hey, I can do this, and this is how you helped me to feel like I can do this, and this is something that I don't know why I had a lot of anxiety about it, and I just didn't know how to approach it, and see, okay, what was the root of that? Was it when we offered them tangible resources? Was it when it wasn't just a conversation, or what was that thing?
So you're saying you as a school director want to know from your CMAs which kinds of action steps are core members finding it easy to take and not easy to take.
And what did you do that was different in those scenarios?
I think too, when you sort of get CMAs invested in doing this, and getting CMAs to have those conversations too, where like I know last summer if there was something where I knew, core member and I set out 3 action steps and there was one that wasn't happening or didn't happen, okay, well, why is that not happening? What can you do instead? Or like how do we need to fix that so that that does happen? And
I think in a more formal sense, like as an SD, not only looking at debrief notes like after the classroom observation, but before the classroom observation. So maybe you can go in, like if I'm a member of a core member on a Tuesday, they're looking at their notes from the previous week, see what they're supposed to be working on, and seeing if that's actually what's being prioritized in the classroom when you're up there.
And I think having those really concrete next steps, like keeping those in binders, where you can, and I think they are in the binders in the classroom. Maybe not off my head. But like, and so you can look and see, okay, those next steps, like did that.
Core members are invested too. Like, I as a school director should be able to say like, hey, what are you working on? Like, just to any random person, and like, A, if they can't articulate that, and B, if they're like frustrated or something like that, that's like, I think a sign that it's not happening.
There was an alarming number of core members that I would ask to, like, what is the rubric that you are working on this week that came out of your core investigation? Couldn't tell me. Could not tell me. That's a problem. Like, clearly, I mean, that's a facilitation of the conversation problem. I mean, clearly, you're going to be observing these conversations, which is one way, but that's something I think we need to talk about. Like, I was just like, I know a lot's going on, but that's supposed to be like a singular focus for the core member, and they cannot.
And I think that's an important check for the CMA too, because I remember I had one of my core members step out and she knows. She'd be like, no, I'd be like, that kills me as a CMA. Like, what do you mean just after that conversation?
Yeah.
What do you need to
This is fascinating. Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely, and that gives you a chance again to think like what in that conversation about like what else can CMAs be doing in that conversation to make that as
But I also think too, as a manager, if I tell my CMAs, I'm going to walk around tomorrow and I'm going to ask my core members what they're working on. That may help CMAs to understand in a conversation like, man, a real measure of success for this conversation is that this core member leaves totally clear that we have isolated E4 as the thing they're working on. Like, that's your role as a manager. Focus your staff. Set the vision. Focus your staff.
And another measure of in these conversations where you're engaging in really difficult work, and there is so much for that core member to internalize, and understanding how overwhelmed they can be, and understanding that you're having the conversation. How can you then facilitate your CMAs to have that check for understanding of like, am I talking over your head, or are we coming away with the conversation with the same exact thing, or are we walking away with two different understandings and levels of understanding? Which is right.
It is.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like a proactive action is making sure that you are telling your CMAs exactly like, at the end of this conversation, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. Maybe that's like
what are the
make
goals
your
and
core
nuggets?
member tell you what their next steps are and why. And maybe that's it. I don't know.
Yeah, and that, I mean, I think that's one of the things that you guys anyway, but like make sure your core member can repeat back to you, like what happened at the end of this conversation, what are their next steps, why are they doing
it?
So I guess like next, if you're walking around in your school and you're talking to core members and they're not telling you exactly what they're prioritizing, have no clue why, like then what's like the next action? You've checked the reality, so what's the action?
I feel like even with that too, though, I would want to gather more information. Thinking about, okay, so I want to sit through one of those conversations. I want to follow up and sort of like talk to maybe a core member after the conversation about what their next steps are and why, and like sort of figure out where is this really breaking down. Certainly gather more evidence before I sort of plan what needs to happen next. So maybe that CMA needs more assistance with the observation debrief cycle, or maybe it's something where I need to be more clear on my expectations for that CMA. I mean, I just feel like there's a lot of data points that you need to collect there.
I think it's also like really appropriate in gathering that data to just ask like this core member or the CMA, like, why do you think that person left confused, or why do you think that person left X, Y, and Z? Just so like you can get at the root cause, so you can know like maybe whatever, like the CMA lacks the skill to like ask for checks for understanding, So I would want to gather data.
Just going back to that idea too, that the problem isn't investment, the problem is them not following through because they don't know how, or because it wasn't an appropriate next step that was appropriately aligned, or something. Like figuring out that just started by looking at rubric data, looking at their classrooms, and looking at other sources of evidence to understand what that's breaking down.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That how just like with our students, how it can be so easy to interpret something differently than what it actually is. When something doesn't happen, it's a matter of investment, it's a matter of not knowing how, and understanding that when you don't see the follow through, there could be multiple reasons behind that follow through, and it's our job to figure out, okay, like I'm not going to talk about how it's important to be invested when the person's like, hey, I am invested, I just don't know what to do. So being very careful and strategic with how we target our attention.
And even last year, be something as simple as like, what's the